Good morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim, as we continue our journey in his steps. Chapter 5. When Rachel Winslow and Virginia Page separated after the meeting at the First Church on Sunday, they agreed to continue their conversation the next day. Virginia asked Rachel to come and lunch with her at noon, and Rachel accordingly rang the bell at the Page mansion at about 11:30. Rachel herself met her, and the two were soon talking earnestly. "The fact is," Rachel was saying after they had been talking a few moments, "I cannot reconcile it with my judgment of what Christ would do. I cannot tell another person what to do, but I feel that I ought not to accept this offer." "What will you do then?" asked Virginia with great interest. "I don't know yet, but I have decided to refuse this offer." Rachel picked up a letter that had been lying in her lap and ran over its contents again. It was a letter offering her a place in a comic opera with a large company, traveling for the season. The salary was a very good figure, and the prospect held out by the manager of the company was flattering. He had heard Rachel sing that Sunday morning when the stranger had interrupted the service. He had been much impressed. There was money in that voice, and it ought to be used in comic opera, so said the letter, and the manager wanted a reply as soon as possible. "There's no great virtue in saying no to this offer when I have the other one," Rachel went on thoughtfully. "That's harder to decide, but I've about made up my mind. To tell the truth, Virginia, I am completely convinced in the first case that Jesus would never use any talent like a good voice just to make money. But now, take this concert offer. Here is a reputable company with which to travel. It includes an impersonator, a violinist, and a male quartet. All are people of good reputation. I'm asked to go as one of the chorale and to sing lead soprano. The salary, I mentioned it, didn't I, is to be a guaranteed $500 a month for the season. But I don't feel satisfied that Jesus would go. What do you think?" "You mustn't ask me to decide for you," replied Virginia with a sad smile. "I believe Mr. Maxwell was right when he said we must each one of us decide according to the judgment we feel for ourselves to be Christ-like. I'm having a harder time than you are, dear, to decide what he would do." "You are?" Rachel asked. She rose and walked over to the window and looked out. Virginia came and stood by her. The street was crowded with life, and the two women looked at it silently for a moment. Suddenly Virginia broke out as Rachel had never heard her before. "Rachel, what does all this contrast and conditions mean to you as you ask this question of what Jesus would do? It maddens me to think that the society in which I have been brought up, the society to which we both belong, is satisfied year after year to go on dressing and eating and having a good time, and giving and receiving entertainment, spending money on houses and luxuries, and, to ease its conscience, occasionally donating a little money to charity without any personal cost. Like you, I've been educated in one of the most expensive schools in America, launched into society as an heiress, supposed to be a most enviable position. I'm perfectly well. I have had numerous offers of marriage. I can travel or stay at home. I can gratify almost any want or desire, and yet, when I honestly try to imagine Jesus living the life I have lived, and am expected to live, and doing for the rest of my life what thousands of other rich people do, I am under condemnation for being one of the most selfish, useless creatures in all the world. I have not looked out this window for weeks without a feeling of horror towards myself as I see the humanity that passes by this house." Virginia turned away and walked up and down the room. Rachel watched her and could not repress the rising tide of her own growing definition of discipleship. Of what Christian use was her own talent of song? Was the best she could do to sell her talent for so much a month? Go on a concert company's tour? Dress beautifully? Enjoy the excitement of public applause? And gain a reputation as a great singer? Was that what Jesus would do? She was not morbid. She was in sound health, was conscious of her special gifts as a singer, and knew that if she went out into public life, she could make money and achieve fame. It is doubtful if she overestimated her ability to accomplish all of what she was capable. And Virginia? What she had just said smote Rachel with great force because of the similar position in which the two friends found themselves. Lunch was announced, and they went out, and were joined by Virginia's grandmother, Madame Florence Page, a handsome, stately woman of 65, and Virginia's brother Roland, a man who spent most of his time at one of the clubs. Roland had no ambition for anything, but he did have a growing admiration for Rachel Winslow, and whenever she dined at the Pages, if he knew of it, always planned to be home. These three made up the Page family. Virginia's father had been a banker and grain speculator. Her mother had died 10 years before, her father within the past year. The grandmother, a Southern woman in birth and training, had all the traditions and feeling that accompany the position of wealth and social standing. She was a shrewd, careful businesswoman of more than average ability. To a large measure, the family property and wealth was invested under her personal care. Virginia's portion was her own without any restriction. She had been trained by her father to understand the ways of the business world, and even the grandmother had been compelled to acknowledge the girl's capacity for taking care of her own money. Perhaps two persons could not be found anywhere less capable of understanding a girl like Virginia than Madame Page or Roland. Rachel, who had known the family for many years, could not help thinking of what confronted Virginia in her own home when once she decided on the course which she honestly believed Jesus would take. Today at lunch, as she recalled Virginia's outbreak in the front room, she tried to picture the scene that would at some time occur between Madame Page and her granddaughter. "I understand that you are going on stage, Miss Winslow. We are all delighted for you," said Roland during the conversation that had not been very animated. Rachel reddened and felt annoyed. "Who told you?" she asked, while Virginia, who had been very silent and reserved, suddenly roused herself and appeared ready to join in the talk. Roland quickly responded, "Oh, we hear a thing or two on the street. Besides, everyone saw that talent manager at church 2 weeks ago. He doesn't go to church to hear the preaching. In fact, I know other people who don't either, not when there's something better to be heard." Rachel did not change color this time, but she answered quietly, "You're mistaken. I am not going on stage." "It's a pity. You'd make a hit. Everybody's talking about your singing." Roland seemed nonplussed. Before Rachel could say anything, Virginia broke in. "Whom do you mean by everybody?" "Whom? I mean all the people who hear Miss Winslow on Sunday. What other time do they hear her? It's a great pity, I say, that the general public outside Raymond cannot hear her voice." "Please, let us talk about something else," said Rachel a little sharply. Madame Page glanced at her and spoke with gentle courtesy. "My dear Roland never could pay an indirect compliment. He's like his father in that. But we are all curious to know something of your plans. We claim the right from old acquaintance, you know. And Virginia had already told us of your concert company offer." "I supposed, of course, that was public property," said Virginia, smiling across the table. "I was in the news office the day before yesterday." Yes, replied Rachel hastily. "I understand that, Madame Page. Well, Virginia and I have been talking about it. I have decided not to accept, and that's as far as I have gone as yet." Rachel was conscious of the fact that the conversation had, up to this point, been narrowing her hesitation concerning the company's offer. She wanted a solution that would absolutely satisfy her own judgment of Jesus' probable action. It had been the last thing in the world, however, that she had desired to have her decision made in any way so public as this. Somehow, what Roland Page had said and his manner in saying it had hastened her in the matter. "Would you mind telling us, Rachel, your reasons for refusing the offer? It looks like a great opportunity for a young girl like you. Don't you think the general public ought to hear you? I feel like Roland about that. A voice like yours belongs to a larger audience in Raymond and First Church." Rachel Winslow shrank from making her plans or her thought public. But with all her repression, there was possible in her an occasional sudden breaking out that was simply an impulsive, thoroughly truthful expressing of her most inner personal feeling. She spoke now in this way. "I have no other reason than a conviction that Jesus Christ would do the same thing," she said, looking into Madame Page's eyes with a clear and earnest gaze. Madame Page looked aghast, and Roland stared. Before her grandmother could say anything, Virginia spoke. The rising color on each cheek showed how she was stirred. "Grandmother, I told you we have both promised to make that the standard of our conduct for a year. We have not been able to arrive at our decisions rapidly. The difficulty in knowing what Jesus would do has perplexed Rachel and I a great deal." Madame Page sat up a little straighter in her chair, gathering her expensive finery about her in an authoritative way. She looked straight at Virginia before she spoke. "Of course I understand Mr. Maxwell's statements. They are perfectly impractical to put into practice. I felt confident at the time that those who promised would find this out after a trial and abandon the whole idea as visionary and absurd. I have nothing to say to Miss Winslow's decisions, but," she paused and continued with a sharpness that was new to Rachel, "I hope you have no foolish notions in this matter, Virginia." "I have a great many notions," replied Virginia quietly. "Whether they are foolish or not depends upon my right understanding of what Jesus would do. As soon as I find out, I shall act." "Excuse me, ladies," said Roland, rising from the table. "The conversation is getting a little beyond my depth." He left the dining room, and there was silence for a moment. Madame Page was angry, and her anger was formidable, although checked in some measure by the presence of Rachel. "I am older by several years than you young ladies," she said, and her hauteur seemed to Rachel to rise up like a great frozen wall between them. "What you have promised in the spirit of what I call false emotion is impossible to perform." "Do you mean, grandmother, that we cannot possibly act as our Lord would? Or do you mean that if we try to, we shall offend the customs and prejudices of society?" asked Virginia. "It is not required. It is not necessary. Besides, how can you act with any—" Madame Page paused, broke off her sentence, and then turned to Rachel. "What will your mother say about your decision, my dear? Is it not foolish? What do you expect to do with your voice, anyway?" "I don't know what mother will say," Rachel answered, with a sudden shrinking from trying to give her mother's probable answer. If there was a woman in all of Raymond with great ambitions for her daughter's success as a singer, Mrs. Winslow was that woman. "Oh, you will see it in a different light after wise thought. Furthermore," continued Madame Page, rising from the table, "you will live to regret it if you do not accept the concert company's offer, or something like it." Rachel left soon after, feeling that her departure was to be followed by a very painful conversation between Virginia and her grandmother. As she afterward learned, Virginia passed through a crisis of feeling during the scene with her grandmother that hastened her final decision as to the use of her money and her social standing. And that's the end of Chapter 5. Next week we'll continue with Chapter 6. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.